Hello and welcome to another one of our videos. This time we're going to look at how you can focus on the uses bit of our little acronym when writing about poetry. So as we said in the previous video, this is what the examiner's looking for from your poetry response. So they're looking for you to mention ideas, addressing the question, use of quotations, terminology, effect, and what the message is and the reasons behind the choices. Now we're going to focus on AO2 in this session. As mentioned before, this is kind of the threads that you want to have in your writing. Now we don't want to make it so there's a clear kind of paragraph structure, but really what you should be doing is you should be talking about the way the writer presents the thing, the topic. You should be talking about what the writer uses to show that topic and what's the writer trying to teach us. So presents, uses and teaches. So this video is going to look at the uses bit. Now just to help you a little bit, at the bottom and you can see in the blue I've put down what, how, why. That's just another way of putting that put thing. So the what is the presents, the how is the uses and the teaches is why. So what is the writer showing us? How do they show us this, and why are they showing us that? So it's just another way if you struggle with the put thing. So, what are the common mistakes that people make with terminology? Well, often they forget to use it at all, and it's one of the key markers that gets you into that grade 4. If you don't mention terminology, you're not going to get a grade 4 on the literature response. So you do need to mention, even just mentioning technique or word and using those terms would help you get there. Now the opposite of that, and this might seem a bit strange, but students who list techniques are just as worse as students who don't mention techniques, because what they do is they just fire off techniques, and that's what the examiner doesn't want. They do not have a checklist of all the different techniques that are in a poem. What they want you to do is take one of those and explain it in great detail rather than listing loads of them. This is quite obvious, using the wrong technique and the terminology. So for example, if you're calling something a verb and it's actually an adjective, so just make sure you're really clear and you know what you're talking about. Not explaining why the writer used a particular word or technique. Now often what happens with students is they mention a technique and then they mention another technique and then they mention another technique, and that listing. And what we want you to say is, well, why did the writer use that simile? Why did they use that verb? What's the reasoning behind it? Rubbish explanation. So for example, that is where students go, well, it makes the reader read on, or to shock the reader. You know, you need to be more specific with that, and we've done that work already with some of the language and our SQUID, an acronym to help you with that. So it's that kind of create a sense of, create a feeling, create this mood, create this atmosphere. Those are things you want to be looking for. Not developing explanations. All right. English is different to other subjects because it's about your explanation. Yes, you can spot things. Yes, you can explain, but it's really that explanation. The more developed explanation you have, the better you will be. And that's what holds a lot of students back, because you know your stuff, but unless you explain it, you're not convincing the examiner that you know the text really, really well, or you've understood the idea really, really well. So that's where you've got to think about it in the different terms to other subjects. It's not the number of points, it's how you explain that gets you those marks. And not exploring ideas. You know, if a poem is talking about nature being scary to mankind, then explore that idea. What does it tell us about? And take us down different paths and different routes with an idea, rather than just stating things. So again, it's that explanation, but exploring. So it could mean this, or it could mean that. And not linking things together. You know, really what we want you to do in your paragraph is link ideas to techniques, to the effect, to the meaning, to the message. And my best way to describe it is like ping pong. You want to be kind of bouncing from one thing to another, and that's why having a clear structure of write an idea first and a technique doesn't always work. And for the best students, what they'll do is they might start with a technique, then talk about the effect, and then go to the idea, and then bring in another technique. It's about a combination of those things together, and that's why we kind of put emphasis this time on the PUT method, so that if you're talking about how it presents it and the uses and what it teaches us, then you're kind of doing all those things. So in the previous video, if you haven't watched the presents video, watch the presents video, because I've gone through this question and some of the ideas that we've had. So what we're going to do is going to take it a little step further now. We're going to look at, right, how can we bring in techniques? Because at the moment we've got lots of ideas there. And so we're going to take this a little further. So here's the question. So the impact settings have on a person's emotions and thoughts. And so I'm going to come up with an idea. So William Blake presents the idea that a place can limit a person's sense of freedom mentally rather than physically. So if you can see, I've got an idea about this idea, I've got a feeling, a sense of freedom, and I'm using words like mentally and physically. So that shows you that kind of I've gone up to not just saying, well, it makes setting makes people feel sad. I've used better vocabulary to describe things, but also talked about some high-level ideas. You know, the idea that a place can affect somebody mentally and physically. Now, how do I bring in my techniques? So, I'm going to go from one here. Mind-forged manacles. So I've got a metaphor. So I'm going to say, well, to show this lack of freedom and the fact that it affects people mentally, I'm going to use this. Now this is where I build up my explanation. So I'm going to say, right, they're trapped by their mind. The mind-forged manacles. Now, forging means making, and generally forges are something where you make something metal. So you melt something down to build something, machinery. So this idea that the mind forged, so the mind has created, and the manacles like handcuffs that's chained them. So I'm saying that with this metaphor, it shows us how they're trapped by their mind. Now, if I'm talking about manacles, I've got the idea of slavery, that somebody's trapped. We've also got the sense of lack of freedom. If they're trapped, they're not in control. So this is what I can say about this metaphor. Now, always when you get a technique, always think about, is it positive or negative? Mind-forged manacles, it's a negative effect, isn't it? And so start building onto, well, what kind of negative effects? So maybe we're supposed to feel guilty about these people who are trapped. Or maybe angry because they're trapped and we can't do anything about it. And a sense of empathy, of their frustration. And you can see that we can start building on to this idea that we've got here. And then I can kind of take my idea a little bit further, and then I can kind of link it in to other techniques the writer's done. So the repetition of the marks of shows us that it's not just one person and that everybody's feeling this way. And you know, we know that obviously if you look at somebody's face, that shows us what they're thinking or feeling. So you can see that we can see it everywhere in London. And so it's affecting everybody. And the fact I've got the idea of the infants crying and the idea of the children and the sound effects is that, again, it makes this sound that everybody's feeling this, everybody's trapped. And obviously the idea that parents could affect their children. So if the parents are upset and the children are upset, it creates this whole sense of this place of London being everybody upset. Another word I've picked out is the verb wander. So this idea of wandering, well, that's freedom. So when we look at the opening of the poem, the person walking through London has got that sense of freedom, and yet the people in London have got this lack of freedom, that sense of being trapped. So you can see what William Blake is trying to do. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the messages because that's going to be something we're going to look in another video. But I'm showing you how you can start talking about one little word or technique and then build up your explanation, because this is what you can do. So you can talk about what does it mean? then you can talk about the effect, and then you can talk about linking it to other things and showing actually, because that's what writers do, they make combinations of techniques to make a particular idea. Now if we take this further then, because obviously what we're supposed to do in the poetry is we're supposed to compare the poems. Okay, now one of the problems that students do is they think it's about comparing techniques. Very rarely will you find similar techniques in a poem. And that's where students struggle, because they're trying to find something. So they're going to try to find a metaphor in one poem, and they'll try and search the other poem for another metaphor and see how they use metaphors differently. The best thing to do is compare ideas, because they're going to do something differently. So we're saying that William Blake presents the idea that place can limit a person's sense of freedom. If we look at the prelude, what we could say, well, it's actually quite different, because in the prelude it's about somebody realizing that they're not free and that there's something greater in control. Now London is about an outsider coming into London and seeing that these people are trapped, and it's the way of their thinking. Whereas what we've got in the prelude is somebody discovering that they are not in control. And that's a different perspective, because William Blake's is an outsider. So the people in London don't realise and probably can't see what's happening. But in the prelude, the voice is making a discovery, and they're realising, understanding what's going on, and that there's something far greater. So let's take that a little bit further. So there's our statement, our idea. So all this could be in the same paragraph. Now, I've picked up one little bit, and remember, you don't need that much. It's not about firing hundreds of techniques. It's about taking your idea and linking it into the choices that the writer's made. So I've picked up this bit about the peak towered up between me and the stars. And so what we've got is we've got this metaphor, because we've got nature being bigger than man, and it's towering over him. So the idea that we could get from that is this idea that it's bigger. So nature is bigger than man. It's towering, it's looking down at man. So actually, man is small compared to nature. And if it's so big and it's towering, something that cannot be beaten, and there's a sense of it being like its own god. Now another interesting thing that we've got is that it's between me and the stars. Now often we tend to think about stars about being about discovery and about exploring and about becoming something greater. And if you have a look, that nature is between man and the stars. And so nature is actually stopping man from achieving his full potential. Now, what's the feelings we can get out from this towered? Well, that sense of fear. You know, if something's towering up at you, it's usually quite scary, and so it's got power. And using great words like superiority, so the nature is superior, stronger, more powerful, and man is inferior, smaller. And this sense of if something's towering over you, you can't really escape it as well, so it's inescapable. What can I link it into? Well, the extract from Prelude's interesting because really the start of the poem is all about that freedom. He steals a boat and he's on the lake and he's rowing and it's lovely and it's perfect and he thinks he's all free. And actually, you know, that nature is kind of there in the background and it's going to surprise him. So we see that discovery. So you could make a link to this again. At the beginning it was quite idyllic and perfect and beautiful, and there was a sense of freedom, and hence why it was silent and it was just him, and it shows how he's in power. And then we've got this idea of like a swan, that how it was beautiful and he was in control, but yet that dual nature of nature itself, and that it can be both scary but also quite beautiful. And then finally we could link it into the idea of the dream. And obviously, you know, if we look at London, it's about the mind. Or we could say, well, Wordsworth is also looking about the mind. And actually, for him, it's that moment of discovery of fear, but actually it becomes a dream and it haunts him continuously. And at the end of the poem, it keeps going back to it. So that idea of, the mind, that a setting has affected him. And we can see between the two poems that obviously in London, they're not really aware of what the setting is doing to them. Whereas in the prelude, he wasn't aware, but actually he's now discovered what's happened, and he's now aware, and so he's haunted by it. And so you can see two different poems, but also they're taking that same idea, how a setting can affect a person and affect their mental state. One is kind of like stuck in this fixed mindset, another is haunted, and they didn't realise what was going on. Now we can turn that into a paragraph, and this isn't the full paragraph, but you can kind of see where we could go with it. And again, it's that explaining. You're not talking about hundreds of techniques. What you need to do is take one technique and really, really explore it in great detail, rather than just firing different techniques. And think about this idea that you are comparing the ideas in the poem. Your use of techniques is just to support your ideas. Now, there are three things you need to think about this now. So, the first symbol that you've got, the light bulb, is your ideas. The second is the techniques and the language. And then the third bit is the reasons behind it. So what you've got to do is you've got to kind of do a connection between these things. My general preference, and the best way to do it really, is to start with the ideas. Start with an idea and then link into the technique. If you start looking at poems from the techniques, it's quite hard to explain why a writer has used a technique, because you're having to invent stuff. If you start with an idea and say, well, this poem is about showing us how man is blind to the way that the government controls them. That is an idea. And then you can go to the poem and then you can go, right, okay, well, how does the poet show us this idea that man is unaware, that they're blind to it? Okay, so what can I use to do that? And then you can then think about, well, why? Why has the writer decided to do that? Now, there will be more videos coming along to help you with looking at poetry. If you've got any questions, do message us on Show My Homework and we'll work to help with you. Keep an eye out for more videos on the YouTube channel, because we'll keep adding to these as we go along to help you. Thank you.